All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast, and today's show is jam-packed. We asked the question, what do you need to consider when you invest in Victoria? We cover all of that, and also, do you sell the goose that lays the golden egg, Ben? We talk about that at length. What else do we cover?
Bryce, we've also got an interesting question about rent vesting. Is rent vesting what people think it is? And finally, in what's making property news, frustrated red tape. How do we perform against our peers when we're trying to get property delivered? All we've got is red tape. So we'll talk more about that in what's making property news.
We're going to get rid of the red tape, folks. Let's rip into the show.
Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle channel, co-host of Escape from the City on the ABC, and partner of Empower Wealth Advisory. Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the founder of Empower Wealth Advisory, named the 2018 and 2019 Property Advisory Firm of the Year. Stay tuned as they bring you the insider's guide to property, finance and money management.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast, and welcome back to you too, Ben. Hey, just before we kick it off, mate, what happened? You throw in the towel and let us come back, did ya?
Well, maybe. I mean, look, there's a couple of things that happened. There was a couple of big turning points throughout the course of the game. So I got mixed feelings, right? The first part is, what do we have? 6 players with under 10 games experience.
Oh, come on. No one wants to know about that. They want to know
debutants,
about the draw.
Right. And so, so we're 25 points up with about 11 minutes to go, and we think, all right, this is pretty good. And then we see, a few things happen, and then obviously the big talking point was that free kick.
The free kick where it was clearly stated, if you don't throw it back to the umpire, you'll give away.
Clearly. So they've missed 1,100 other free kicks from other games throughout the course of the.
So I can summarise for all the folks, Ben,
Matthew Nichols,
who weren't watching. Basically, you guys pooped the bed. That was all that we had.
Okay,
you had the game sewn up. You were winning, and then Mourinho came back. If only you were there, that would have been amazing. I was there, Ben.
Was it a good experience?
It was a great experience. You had great company. Mate, it's the only way to go to the footy now, I reckon.
It's not bad, is it? I would have been very annoyed if we had lost.
Yeah.
But to get the 2 points given basically the team we put out on the field, I'll take the 2 points.
My father-in-law, he's got the Carlton excuses. You've just got the Collingwood excuses, mate. You were done by a better team on the night, and you should have sewn it up, and you let us back in, and it was a beautiful. I couldn't stop thinking about you, mate, when the siren went off. I've got to be honest. I couldn't stop thinking about you there in the Mooney manner, looking at the screen, thinking,
maybe that one got away. Yeah, thanks to Matthew Nichols.
Yep, let's hope it doesn't come back to haunt you at the end of the year, Ben.
Is he the umpire that James Hird got the fined against for naming and shaming?
It's the Carlton. What do Carlton and Collingwood supporters got in common? They love to talk about umpiring.
Hirdy played for Essendon for the record, but yes,
but I've got a father-in-law if I was Carlton. It feels like I'm having the same conversation.
I always worry when number 15 in yellow comes anywhere near a Collingwood game. I've always had that feeling.
Wow, there we go. Mate, webinar last night.
Yes.
So it's for people, they can go and check out the replay if they missed it.
Yeah, so obviously Picker, I had a chat. Really, it was more sort of taking people through some of the concepts that I see from the media, from the politicians, and also from the general public in terms of the misconceptions and misinformation they have. So I just talk through the data and put a couple of other alternative views in front of people using the data. So hopefully people will get a bit of value out of that. And of course, the bigger message here is if you do see misinformation being shared, you can now have access to that information and reshare it through obviously Twitter or Facebook or wherever, because it is a problem if people just naturally assume, what's a classic one, Bryce, is they go, a house that's being bought by an owner-occupier, a house being sold by an investor is automatically being added to the owner-occupier pool. It's just not quite as simple as that. So I talk in detail about that as well. So, yeah, anyway, so hopefully people will get some value out of that, and
For all
we'll
the
move
members,
on.
they can go and check out the replay. It was a ripper. So, hey, we got a big show to cover today. So my Mindset Minute is short and sharp, Ben, and it's just a
Yes.
timely reminder. It's Lao Tzu, Tzu, Lao Tzu, Ben, the Tao
Yes.
Te Ching. If you don't change the direction you're going, you'll wind up where you're headed. Hey? So in the context of what people are doing with their money management and their investing, Ben, I just thought, simple and effective reminder for folks that if you don't stop doing what you already are doing, chances are you'll end up what you're already getting, right? So Lao Tzu said it very, very succinctly. If you don't change the direction you're going, you'll wind up where you are headed. So folks, ponder that as you riff into this weekend, whether or not that applies to you or if it applies to someone else that you know. But big day today, Ben, Q&A
Yep.
day. We've got some great questions from our community. The first one is from Georgia, and it is a question about advice on purchasing in Victoria. Ben, we live in Victoria, so we
We
probably
do.
should be pretty okay at this question. So let's have a little listen to the question from Georgia.
Hi, Ben and Bryce. My name's Georgia. I want to say thanks very much for your work on the podcast. I really enjoy listening to it and find it very educational. My husband and I currently live on the Gold Coast. We have living in our principal place of residence, which is a house we bought about a year and a half ago. We also own an investment property on the Gold Coast, which we bought in 2018, and it was originally our principal place of residence. But since we moved to our house, we now have that as an investment property. We've had really good returns from both properties over the last few years. So we're looking at releasing some equity from our investment unit and then purchasing another property, potentially in Melbourne. It seems like Melbourne properties are in high demand at the moment, and I have heard your advice on buying in Melbourne or Sydney if you possibly can. So I think it would be a good long-term investment, and potential for growth would be positive. Possibly looking at the western suburbs because they seem a bit more affordable, and I think they'll be a popular area going forward. I know Victoria's had some changes to tenancy laws, so I was wondering what we should be aware of if we're thinking of purchasing in Victoria. I know there's a lot of extra costs and compliance requirements, so what would be your advice and recommendations of things to be aware of if we were looking at purchasing a property in Victoria for investment purposes? Thanks again for your work, and keep doing what you're doing. Cheers.
There you go, Ben. Someone's obviously done very well on the Gold Coast at a very critical part of the cycle. To be an investor on the Gold Coast would be nothing but blue sky there. But tell us what you think, Ben. What should Georgia be thinking about investing in Victoria?
Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely. We talk about wanting to make sure if things are possible for you that you can try and secure property in the Greater Melbourne area or property in the Greater Sydney area, because they are our two powerhouse economic engines in terms of economic activity. And that is ultimately one of the fundamental drivers to continue to create employment and income and wealth over time. And that obviously is ultimately reinvested, et cetera, et cetera. But there are a couple of headwinds in the Melbourne market, and that is what we've also been talking about in terms of, if you think about the timing, so being sort of thinking about being counter-cyclical, that's how you've got to look at Melbourne at the moment. And here's the reasons why. If you think about the risks, and in episode 78, Bryce, we talk about 10 of the investor risks that you need to think about. And we've had this come up a bit also in the survey, but I just want to very, very quickly run through some of the risks associated with investing in property, because everyone thinks it's all just blue sky and we don't have any type of cycles. But you've just got general investment risks. So that's the sort of stuff that you don't see coming: pandemics, black swan events, a global financial crisis, wars, those type of things. So there's always that big macro stuff going on. You've got personal risk in terms of incomes that you're earning to service the loan. You've got obviously market risk, which is what sort of, is underlying Melbourne at the moment. I'll talk more about that. Developer risk, which is obviously a supply story. Management risk, if a property's not well managed, you've got wear and tear and damage on the property. You've got legislative risk, and we're seeing that with APRA and also potentially with the likes of governments, and that's the one I want to come back on and talk more about for Melbourne specifically. But you can think about how you've got APRA throttling lending, which is forcing everyone into the affordability side. So that's why cheaper properties are outperforming at the moment, because it's driving all the demand in that particular location. But you've got potential risk of crazy ideas from politicians around rental freezes and those types of things. You've got liquidity risk, which is about managing cash flow. You've got gearing risk. When you borrow money, there's always that type of risk. You've got value risk in terms of valuations fluctuating, volatility there. Tenancy risk. You've got any type of event risk, such as a flood, fire, those types of things. You've got volatility more generally in terms of when we talk about fundamentals of investing. The investor risk is you in terms of your relationship and whether those things sort of break down. And then the last one is the economic activity risk. And they're the two big drivers for Melbourne at the moment. So what we have is an economy that looks good in Victoria and especially Melbourne, because we've got unprecedented government spending. So that is propping up the economy down here in Melbourne. And that, again, looks good in terms of how we compare to other states. But the problem with that is the record levels of debt that the government is going into and the ability to be able to service that debt over time. And that will mean at some point when a better economic management government comes into play, they're going to have to introduce some austerity. And that austerity will slow that big economic flywheel that we talk about, that water wheel. And effectively, it will mean there'll be higher unemployment and there'll be those types. So we'll have to move through some type of tightening cycle, because what you try to do with an economy is you try and keep growing the pie. And so it's okay to take on a level of risk around debt as a government and spending, and then you try and grow the economic pie that then allows you to run a surplus to pay that debt down. But sometimes that debt spiral can just get out of control, and that's what's happened in Victoria. It's unprecedented, the amount of debt that we've got down here. So that is a problem in the short term. If you then combine that with, obviously, all right, well, that's all the debt we've got. So who are we going to get that money from? Well, 53% of taxes come from property, stamp duties, and also land taxes. So you can see that the government of the day is whacking the investor, and that's seen an unprecedented level of investors selling up in Victoria, both at the residential but also the commercial property market as well. We're starting to see some of those sort of high street commercial type properties certainly being flogged off because of the extreme land taxes that we've got down here. So the government have got themselves into a corner, and that's going to take several years to play itself out. So that's first. And then you've got the legislative risk, which is basically putting too much control back away from the property owner and the small business owner. So we're very careful and cautious as investors now about where we put our tens of billions of dollars. So we're seeing a lot of that money fly into Western Australia and into other markets where the conditions are more favourable for property investors in terms of running their small businesses for private rental accommodation. So with all of that said, you might be thinking that I'm anti-Melbourne and that. No, because that's what I'm talking about in this short term, this next 2, 3, even 5 years potentially, where we're going to have to work our way through these challenges, and we're going to have to make some tough decisions. But on the other side of that is a multicultural society, strong population growth with immigration into Melbourne. It's very much considered the number one destination for people coming from international to settle in Australia. So from all of those points of view, you then start to say, well, medium to longer term, when others are fearful, it might be a great time to lock in that property and think in the decades, not necessarily just in the short couple of years. And so when you do that, you're going to hopefully then see that, okay, I might have some downside risk in the short term, but I'm going to get 100% of that upside that comes out the other side. And I think that's, in my mind, where Melbourne sits at the moment. I'm certainly talking to a lot of other professionals in this space. They see an opportunity in Melbourne, but they understand that opportunity could be dormant for several years. So less competition to be able to get a good buy in the Melbourne, and seeing flat prices, maybe even a further decline in prices in Melbourne. But then obviously Melbourne's, position in a wealth context should be in that sort of second or third position overall behind Sydney in terms of the economic output. And so that's why, the economic story is so important for Melbourne and what we see the government of the day do here. And so it's a pretty long answer, Bryce, but there's a lot to cover off in terms of a conversation around the Melbourne market. So long term, very bullish. Short term, I'm saying that, you've got some challenges and you just got to be aware of those challenges.
I guess for me, Georgia, it's to extend what Ben just said. The decision to buy in Victoria is a 2030 conversation. What would you be looking at in 2030, and think about what you bought now? So Ben and I both have multiple properties in the Victorian market, and we are still very bullish about what's going to happen by 2030. But notwithstanding all that Ben just said, investing in this market is largely a counter-cyclical investing play. But here's the deal: if you want to have Melbourne and or Sydney in your portfolio, as you play the 10, 15, 20-year game, arguably now could be one of the best times to get that, because you can jockey for position for some of the best locations and some of the best assets that when the market is got a hell of a lot of competition, it's very, very difficult to secure those properties. So again, you have that opportunity to get that position that you will be very, very thankful that you did in 2030. So look, not much more to add. Medium, long term, no problem, Victoria. There's obviously short term. We weren't able to foresee the impact that the government would have been on the record levels of debt and the world's longest lockdowns, and
a lot of
all
that's
that
been
stuff.
blowouts, Bryce. They continue to keep investing, and a lot of the projects that they quoted have almost doubled in value in terms of the final cost of those projects. And so, you've got a government who are looking for excuses, and they're sort of saying, well, the Reserve Bank of Australia said that interest rates won't change until 2024, and so we thought we're getting really cheap money, so we went really hard at our infrastructure project. And if you think about the silver lining, because there always is a silver lining in the sense of the spend on infrastructure, is that once we get the bypass roads and a few of those other projects, the new underground rail system, those types of things do have some meaningful longer term value for the city. The suburban rail loop is a complete waste of time and money. It's not going to be delivered until 2050. So that is absolutely poor decision making from a government. But in terms of the stuff that's coming out of the ground or being finished over the course of the next 5 or so years, those things will have a meaningful impact in terms of efficiency, productivity, people movement, the ability to build more accommodation around those transport nodes and transport hubs. So those things will have some economic payback. But at the moment, that's the problem, because the government is also then challenged by the amount of work they've got on, and the unions demanding higher wages and everything else. They've just got real problems, and they really don't know how to say no, and they don't know how to make tough decisions in this state. So, the toughest decision they made was to get out of the Commonwealth Games, which cost us another $700 million. In addition to, if you remember, the East-West link, that was also an actually essential bit of infrastructure which they pulled out of politically, which cost us $1.3 million, and we didn't get anything out of that. $1.3 billion, I should say. It's
million.
Yeah. So obviously, I'm not a fan of the way in which this government runs the economy down here, and that will play out over the course of the next couple of years. We'll see it being a lot tougher in Victoria than anywhere else. And whereas I see some of the other states who are in great shape economically, great shape in terms of how they're running their economies, and those towns and cities will probably outperform the Melbourne market over the next couple of years.
So, Ben, I was at ARIC over the weekend, just gone, and Paul Ryan, the senior economist for REA, was doing a talk that I sat down and had to listen to, and he was putting up some incredible data and stats, and one of those was there's just that evidence of investors pulling out of the Victorian market. So I think, I guess the point for that, Georgia, for your question. It's largely around there's disincentives right now, but to everything that Ben spoke about, there will be a point where incentives come back to incentivize investors back into the market, because the rental market is only going to get tighter, which is good news for you if you still want to consider buying in that market. The outlook for the amount of people that are going to move here is still very, very good. So hopefully that's given you some help. I think that there's an opportunity counter-cyclically to get a better location and a better property that will serve you in 2030. But there's definitely some short-term pain that goes.
Just quickly, Bryce, some listing data there that's pretty current. So 37.5% increase in recent listings in the last, basically new listings in the last 12-month change. Total listings are up 15%. Now compare that to, say, a Perth, where you've got, sort of new listings only 3.7%, but total listings are down 24%. And Darwin's are down 22%. So you've got these really tight markets where that supply and demand is out of balance. And that's why you're seeing, certainly the Perth market, and Adelaide's down sort of 16%. So you're just seeing an imbalance in that market, and that's why they will continue to sort of do quite well in the short term in terms of price pressure.
Good question, Georgia. Thank you for that. Next one's from Justin. This was a question that came back from our community survey that we just recently sent out, Ben, so I'll read it out. Can you start talking more about the option of selling? Your podcast seems to advocate for a buy and hold, retire debt strategy. Every podcast talks about buying a property, then cash out equity when the property grows in value to go again. However, this is not always achievable when someone has reached their serviceability cap. As such, I think the option of selling to access equity to redeploy into another investment should also be talked about as a valid option to grow wealth, Ben. You always mention that most investors stop at one or two investment properties, but I think this is more due to restricted lending to an individual more so than one's willingness to achieve more. As a general layperson, I know enough to be dangerous, but I can't see how someone on a median income of $67,000 that own their own principal place of residence with $500,000 to $1 million mortgage would be able to service enough debt to afford more than one or two investment properties. Ben, selling. We only talk about retiring debt? No, we've talked about selling over the journey.
Yeah, we do, and I think Justin's got a valid point. I mean, if I'm someone who sees an example on a social media site where someone's pumping their tires for self-interest to try and attract more customers to their business, and they've shown me a property that's originally been bought at $450,000, and then 18 months later they're selling it for $700,000. You look at that and you say to yourself, wow, that is an exponential return over such a short period of time. If we're sort of talking about long-term property performance, median across the country is between 6 and 6.5%. All of a sudden, that particular investor has got a staggering return. So if history is any sort of proof of regression to the mean, it means that the next decade or two in that particular property, they'll have an underperformance, right? So in other words, the market will catch up to itself. So if you think about the ripple effect, once that run has happened, is there an argument to potentially saying, all right, I'm going to flip that asset, and then potentially with the limited amount of borrowing power that I've got to leverage up into the next better market, or that closer in market where the land content and the land value has a potentially higher long-term regression to the mean, where the mean return in those better areas might be 7% versus say 6%. So you could see the argument for such a thing, right? The challenge with all of these is, and obviously, Bryce, we've got a lot of responsibility to our community, where we've always said we're conservative advisors, because we don't want people going out there looking at the latest big rush and then thinking that this is just easy to do, and getting a 60%, 70% return inside a 12, 18-month or 20-month period is actually the norm. It's simply not the norm. So the risk obviously then is in terms of that upsizing. And we did a lot of modeling, and we just sort of said the trade-off and the risk was too great in terms of being a property trader. okay? Because if you do make that wrong decision, or if some of the risks that I just talked about, the unintended risks that we didn't know about, macro, like such as a pandemic or a war or any type of significant change, even to our own circumstances, could tap us out of that. See, the problem with property is it's a very illiquid asset and it's very expensive to change. The liquidity comes in the equity, no doubt about it. We've talked about that a lot. It's a very liquid asset when we use equity. But when we're talking about the cost, the recycle cost to actually sell and then buy back in, pay the capital gains tax and all of those other provisions, you are giving the government a lot of money to help with their debt management, right? So ultimately, from our point of view, we like the idea of using the equity in that property and stepping up. But to Justin's point, it's like that's going to be really hard on someone with a low income. So it then comes back to us and what we've always said from day one: what are your goals? If you're a single person, $2,000 a week will be a very, very comfortable retirement. So maybe it's $75,000 a year as passive income in supplementary to combination of super. Now we know also, from the 1st of July, our super contributions are now moving up towards 12%. So, we're also doing these long-term models to say that one or two properties in combination with your super is actually going to give you a very comfortable retirement. But it's very easy to be seduced by watching these videos and getting them through your algorithm fed constantly into you. Oh, this couple just made an instant $200,000 in equity, and this couple just made this. I mean, it's human nature to want that because it looks so easy to get, right? And and if it was the case, everyone would be doing it. So I think it's really important. And if I put our business hat on, the same also applies. We have had clients who have absolutely knocked it out of the park. Our buyers agents have bought cracking properties, and some of those properties have just shot the lights out. And so those people are blessed. But we've also had other clients who have got long-term strategies, and their properties have been sitting stagnant for a year or two, and they're sort of might be thinking, "Oh, I wish I got one of those." We can't trade like the share market where we can just say, "All right, everyone in the video, right, and let's all load up on the video." That's not how it works. So we are always thinking about trying to get the best return we can in the short term, but with a long-term fundamental play around what that looks like. Because in a lot of cases, all of the cheap stuff in the market at the moment are price-taking markets. They are not price-leading markets. There are no markets where you can buy across this country at $500,000 where it's actually going to be a price leader or a land value leader in terms of that. So you are getting the ripple effect of that valuation. So if you time it well, which is always good and it's part of the research you have to do, that's great. But and I understand Justin's point about then stepping up through each of those stages. So yes, it could be a consideration, Justin. And yes, you're going to see these people tell these stories of one or two highlighted examples. But how many of the other 30, 50, 100, 200 customers that they might have helped have not had that same type of experience? They're going to put their best results under the spotlight for you. And so it really is important for you to get context and understand that, because there's a real risk associated with just coming out and saying, everyone can do this. And if it was that true and if it was that good, then everyone would be doing it. So you've got to be mindful of that.
Justin, a couple of things. Our ideology is why sell the goose that lays the golden egg, right? That's the foundation, right? We've also got a foundation that says we think it's possible to retire on $2,000 per week with enough of a time horizon, having two properties combined with your superannuation. So that's our baseline thesis and a baseline model. But to your point, if you want to sell, fine. But there's opportunity. You're moving from passive to active, and our baseline is being passive investors. But there's a really good opportunity for a bunch of people if they wanted to play the active game. It's in this country, have a principal place of residence exemption that says it's capital gains tax free. So there's a lot of people that have climbed the ladder, Ben, by buying their first property, putting in elbow grease, adding value to it, turning apples into apple pie. Then they sell it. Then they bank the tax free gain, and they go and buy another principal place of residence, and they roll into rolling active projects, which allows them to continually upgrade and create equity, which is fine. It's a valid strategy. But if you survey people at your work, or you survey people at your sports club, or you survey people in your world, the amount of people who've actually done that is small. So it doesn't mean it can't be done, but it's just not the norm. The other thing that's important, and Ben did touch on this really well, is there's recycle costs. So the heavy lifting that's required on the next purchase, based on taking into account the costs to close out on the previous one, means it's got to do a hell of a lot of heavy lifting just to be at ground zero from what you're doing. But I did a talk in Perth last week, Ben. I was invited by a property management business to speak to that property management business around why they should lift their eyes and play the long game for a 30-year game. And one person, so I got them in the room, Ben, and I got them to think, okay, this is not a 1-year game. This is not a 2-year game. This is not a 10-year game. This is a 15 to 30-year game. And someone put their hand up at the end in the Q&A, and she said, Bryce, what if I don't have 30 years left in the game? And I said, well, there's a couple of parts to that answer, but part of the answer is buying these. She was, just for context, she was in early 50s. It's one of the most sought after questions we get, Ben, is it too late to start?
Yep.
Well, maybe it's too late to start to get a quintessential baseline thesis plan that we talk about, where you buy a couple of investment properties, you retire out the debt, you never have to sell anything, and you live off the passive income. It may be a hybrid where at some point in time, when the offset balance gets below a certain level, and we've talked about that as being 100,000, Ben, it may trigger a sale event so that person still has the ability to live a very comfortable retirement in combination with super. But the goal of getting to end of life, end of investment cycle, still owning all the properties and still retiring out the debt, might not be available for everyone. So part of the tailored nature of what we do suggests that some people will actually sell, Ben. It's not our baseline thesis, it's not nirvana, but it still gives people wonderful options that they wouldn't have if they just focused on the average person in Australia's plan of the 40-40-40 plan, 40 years for 40 weeks, for 40 minutes per commute, all those sorts of things. So it's still better to add investment properties, even if down the track you do need to sell. So, Justin, I think your part of your question that says your podcast seems to advocate for a buy and hold retire debt strategy. Yes, that is our baseline, right? But we have built hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tailored and unique plans where the spectrum is they can do that. Some people can buy more than 2 properties, and the other end of the spectrum is that they need to have a hybrid approach, which includes some of the sell down. But at the core level of this question is my first mentor in property back in 1998, when he was teaching the harvest equity to retire on, Ben, not the debt not the debt strategy. It was the harvest, so your debt continued to go up over time, which you can't do now. But he always said to me, why sell the goose that lays the golden egg, Ben? And I've never forgotten that. So if you are in a privileged position where you can invest in property and you can be the person who never sells the goose that lays the golden egg, that is fabulous. But if you don't find yourself in the position where that is viable for you, don't despair. There are other options. There are other alternatives that allow you to have an equally comfortable retirement. It just means the legacy piece and the handing over to the next generation piece looks a little bit different.
Yeah, Bryce, in reading the surveys, and a quick shout out to all those people who gave up their time and gave us some really great feedback. A bit of the theme that was coming through there, I wish I started earlier. So obviously for the younger people, taking action sooner rather than later to get your 40 for the future makes a lot of sense. But what also struck me was there was a lot of commentary from people in their 40s and 50s, to your point, Bryce, who were like, maybe I've left it a bit too late. And I think it's really important. I mean, we've done over 4,100 property plans for our clients, right? Now, to Bryce's point, there's the hundreds that we've done for people in their 40s and their 50s. The benefit they have is equity in their homes, right? The benefit they have is basically being able to leverage that equity. Now, obviously, the people in their 20s and 30s, their biggest challenge is getting started. So they're thinking about rentvesting or how do they get access to that deposit. So there's, that's the difference in terms of that story. But I think the other important point that Bryce was making about, being in Perth and talking to that person who doesn't have as long, a lot of people also think that come 65 or 67, which is the official retirement age, that I then have to sell all my assets and just live. No. So it's okay if you still have some debt that's still part of your overall position. And so, Bryce and I were talking recently about, these types of arrangements. Now, we talk about $100,000. So if you've got liquidity of $100,000 in your bank account, that is a trigger point in our planning process where we then estimate which property we might sell down. Now, that's again, what we're talking about here is rules of thumb. So if you've got super or cash available or share, something that's reasonably liquid and you've got $100,000 left, that's the time when we start saying, okay, if you want to live for the next 12 months, 18 months with that sort of savings, we need to now bring that up because you might be cash flow poor but asset rich. So that's potentially where we might sell down one of those properties. But let's say you might be 2 years off that. So you've done some forecasting and okay, if we keep spending like we are, we'll get down to that 100,000 level in say 2026 or whatever. So, and let's say, a market in Australia at that time is absolutely popping, right? And it's done 40%, 45% in the current part of this cycle. And history tells us in those previous cycles that starts to get when it's a bit toppy. Well, we might say, you know what? At this particular time, that might be the property that we sell just a little bit earlier than when we get to that because we're going to get the top of the cycle. And so that's why every plane that lands is unique and it needs consideration and advice as you potentially are playing out that landing story. Because once you get that right, and then all of a sudden now that whacks a huge amount of debt off, and then your buffers are back up to 350,000 in liquid cash or whatever that is, and you've got a good story. And then you might be able to keep, the plan then might be, okay, well, we get to keep one left. All right. So we have our principal home and we've got one left as part of that particular story. So my message here for those people in their 40s and 50s, it is not too late. In fact, once you know your story with the children in terms of secondary school and whatever, that's exactly the time that you should be planning. Ideally, don't leave it to your 50s. But if you're also in your 50s, it just means the strategy we might take might be a little bit different, where it's not all guns and blazes around getting as much capital growth. We might also have to play around with a little bit of yield in there as well, just to help manage that debt. So we don't want you to be going into retirement with huge amounts of debt. We look at your global loan to value ratio, and we'd like to see that global loan to value ratio sub 40 if we can get it there. And then ultimately the passive income that's coming off those properties over time will eventually get rid of that. But if you don't want to be the richest person in the nursing home, you want to have access to that money when you're in your 60s and 70s when you're the most active. And so from that point of view, that's a game when we sit down and we say, all right, well, what's the best way in which we can get access to that liquidity? And in some cases, it might be selling home, but in other cases, it might be an equity release as part of that, and then ultimately selling the home later on. So there are a lot of other options in terms of estate planning and how you can potentially live out retirement in that particular story. Now, I know we've gone off on a tangent here from Justin's original question, which is, do you flip that property and then position it into a better property? That is something that I would say would be case by case, Justin, and I could make a case in an example where a market has moved 60 or 70% inside 2 years, where that might be a prudent decision. But in most cases, the cycles are 10 to 15% a year. And in that case, it's don't sell the goose that lays the golden egg, stay the tune, release the equity, and add on top of that if you can, is also an acceptable strategy, depending on the risk profile of the customer that we might be talking to.
And remember, most of the flipping shows that you watch based out of America have different tax regimes, so they
very different.
Can't be deployed as straightforward here. So great question, Justin. Hopefully that helped you out. The next one's from Ruva. Ben, she's got a question regarding buying a property to assist in purchasing the dream home. Let's have a little listen now.
Hey, Ben and Bryce, love the podcast. You guys rock. My question is around Rentvesting. Apologies if this has already been answered or rather basic, but I'm struggling to connect the dots and understand the end game of this strategy in real terms. How can buying a property or properties at lower value points and in areas of lower demand in bulk assist in purchasing your dream home outright, mortgage free, in a blue chip suburb in 10 to 15 years' time, as I hear a lot on YouTube? If values continue to rise across the country with a ripple effect from major centres outwards, won't blue chip locations simply remain at a much higher value to those cheap and cheerful investments in Mount Random? May you please outline how this works in practice? Are rent investors assuming that investing elsewhere will outperform their dream locations to then amass enough equity to buy a dream home outright in the future? What does this actually look like? Thank you so much. You guys are amazing. Love the podcast. We tune in and you bring so much value to the community. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Ben, there's a whole mix of concepts and ideas going on there
Yeah.
around Renvesting.
I'll start by sort of saying in the long-term analysis we've done across all of the sort of inner area markets and the outer area markets and so forth, and where the value is, across those sort of 30 plus year analysis, it's usually around a 0.5 to 0.7% increase in the premium locations compared to those outer market locations. Now, that's what's happened in the past. Now, as these property markets get even higher and higher in valuation, will that differentiation still be there? Well, no one really knows, right? Like we've got to be careful in terms of what we're saying there. But if we think about, this wealth transfer that's occurring, and, we still get so caught on this idea, Bryce, that housing should be linked to incomes. And it's just the dumbest idea in terms of for a sophisticated and wealthy country, right? It just doesn't work like that. So to the point of what these people on YouTube are trying to say is like, let's go and buy the cheapest properties. Let's see them ratchet up quickly in terms of profit, and then let's sell them all, and then we can get into a better location, either debt-free, which sounds great on YouTube, right? Or having a smaller mortgage that's available. So we'd all love to do that. That just sounds like, duh, why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we just go out and buy in those particular locations? Well, it comes back to what we were saying before. And I think, in terms of what Rivu was saying around this sort of thing was, Riva was saying around this was that, how does that make sense? Like ultimately, if the compounding is occurring and it's a ripple effect, which we all can see clearly in the data, then will I be able to eventually be able to get into that market? Well, if you've made enough profit, there might be the slim chance that you'll be able to get into that particular market if you keep doing that. But the reality should suggest that even at a 6% compounding return on a $2 million location versus a 7% return on a 400,000 location, that 400, that'll never catch. It'll catch it in 70 or 100 years in terms of what's going to happen. So I understand what she's saying. So I think she's got Rentvesting confused a little. I think, people have taken liberties. So let's give Chris Gray his credit. Chris was the first one who flagged the terminology Rentvesting. Yes, I wrote the first detailed article on it in the Money magazine, a couple of years after Chris flagged that name. So credit to Chris for Rentvesting. But the fundamental understanding and definition of rentvesting is you live where you want to live, and then the surplus that you save between paying off the mortgage and paying the rent, you invest that difference into different locations, or in Chris's case, he just bought lots of units around Sydney, and that's how he did it, because the units were giving him a higher yield. So that's how that plays out. What a lot of people are now, the next generation of people who are playing in the property investment space are expanding the definition of what rentvesting is, whereby they're sort of saying, you just rentvest in the earlier stages and then ultimately sell all those properties and get into your owner-occupied home. In a lot of the simple modelling that we do, it's very hard to be able to affect that because we're conservative in the growth rates that we see. So let's say we use a 6% long-term growth rate in a linear progression of compounding, then we're not going to be able to chase that. But coming back to the point I made, if you get a 70, 60 or a 70% return in a very short period of time, and you're able to replicate that on 3 or 4 executions each time, then you are going to be in a significantly better position that if you did liquidate all of those properties and drop them into a better location for your owner occupied, you will have a lower mortgage as part of that. But the probability of that happening, the ability for you to be able to pick every market consistently over the long period of time is really against standard probability. It just doesn't always happen. So if you get 1 or 2 right, great, but the other 2 might be in bad locations. So all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, I've got a bit of that, but I don't have enough in terms of being able to liquidate the other 2 poor performers as part of that particular story. Still follow the fundamentals of demand and supply to be able to do that. But that's why we're sort of saying safety first, right? Just boringly predictable. Try and do the right things as part of that. And I understand the frustration that younger people would have with that because they want to get ahead. They love the new shiny ideas of these latest strategists who are telling them that this is potentially possible. And they are artificially inflating markets, that they're buying in and then sending people in, and then to make themselves look good. And I think from that point of view, that's always the risk in terms of what we're looking at here around strategies that are built on rock foundations as opposed to strategies that might eventually be built on sand foundations. Sand foundations. I'll get that out.
Sand foundations. There you go, Ben. Ruva, good question. D all the above on what Ben said. Couple of things. What we do for a lot of our clients with Rentvesting is they have let's talk about your blue chip. They have a view that they want to be in a blue chip suburb, but they're A, not ready, and B, financially or in life cycle. So we build a lot of plans where someone will buy a house in a location in their dream suburb with the view to moving into it in 5 or 10 years' time. Because what they're doing is they're then going, to Ben's point around, even at a lower rate, at a higher price, the compounding effect you're always chasing. So what they do is they lock in today's price, then they rentvest and they go off and they live their life. They might be at a stage of life where they go and enjoy what they want to do being somewhere else. But at some point in time, when in the life cycle they want to come back, they'll move in, and they generally have planned to renovate the property and then obviously build up over time, paying off some of those debts. So that's something for you to think about as well. Second thing for me is rentvesting is a very difficult strategy to change, right? So once you lock into rentvesting, because of the high cash flow, high income, high serviceability that's required for you to have a principal place of residence and your mortgage on it, if you decide to deviate from that plan and then go into a rentvesting plan, it's generally something you've got to stay committed to, because it's like changing directions on the Titanic. If you do say, hey, it's not for me, I want to throw in my principal place of residence into this plan at some point down the future, it's like, whoa, heaps of resources required to buy a principal place of residence if that's no longer the plan. So obviously there needs to be a lot of cash flow modelling that goes into it. But I think Ben, there's a lot of stuff happening on YouTube where people are coming up with some wild and wacky ways to get ahead. But we've got a future guest coming up, Ben, who's been investing in the market for 40 plus years, right? And what we will learn in that interview is not much changes. There's the charlatans and get rich quick plans, and everyone's looking for their newest way for us to get ahead quickly. But ultimately, success is not ever not doing the basics right. So, Ruva, I think there's a few things, as Ben said, that we were mixing in that question. Hopefully that's helped. But rentvesting can be a very good strategy if you're very clear on where we're going.
Let's put in the show description a link to the original article. But just also remember, I was asked to rewrite that article last year with a similar type of model because tax rates and scales had come down. Now, I rewrote it back when we thought that the new stage 3 tax cuts were going to be introduced as well, which meant that everyone was on a lower tax rating. All of a sudden, the benefits that you got out of the rent investing that the government and the negative gearing benefits were able to do weren't as great. And so it was a lot more line ball than what it was. And this is where I'm saying regulatory changes and tax and all of those things come into play. So, 10 years ago when we put that article together versus where we are today, I think it was about 10 years ago, it's just a different environment. So you've got to be really clear about your strategy in terms of your long-term goals if you're looking to rent vest indefinitely. But certainly those people who want to buy a couple of properties, add value to them, and then potentially use that as a bigger deposit for their owner-occupied home, just be mindful you're going to be giving up a lot of that money back to the government in terms of tax. So there is a lot of, timing becomes a thing. You don't want to sell them in the same tax year. And then so it's a longer play if you want to do something like that. So this is where it's about, getting advice and making the invisible visible and understanding a couple of scenario models. So if you've got an advisor worth their salt, they should be able to build you a couple of models. And you should be able to say, right, well, here's this strategy and what's the net outcome? And here's this strategy. And how did you get to that strategy? And how did you get to that strategy? And then all of a sudden, once the numbers are in front of you, you can then go, I see, right? I see a lot of these advisors who have no numbers in front of them. They're doing it on the back of napkins. There's no rigor to the analysis. There's no exhaustive cash flow analysis attached to what they're doing. And so they're saying, well, that's the free service. They're not charging for it. I mean, obviously we charge a service because it does require professionalism, strategic assessment, detailed cash flow modeling to actually get to a better insight. I mean, I've said it 100 times in the earlier shows. BHP would not build a mine without a detailed feasibility, cost analysis, and all of that. Qantas would not go out and buy more aircrafts if they didn't do their feasibility analysis and assessment in terms of occupancy to make those planes profitable. All of that stuff is rigorous assessment in terms of, and yet we see mum and dads can watch a YouTube show, go and talk, yeah, it's easy, just follow me, and all of a sudden they're throwing hundreds of thousands of dollars at a guest idea in terms of what the outcome might be. And I think at some point there will be a lot of people who will lose out from that particular strategy.
Good question. Thank you, Ruva. As we head for home, Ben, we've got a listener comment here. Just Dean wrote into us and just said, this information might be interesting for you. Hi, guys. I'm 43 and I've been investing in property for over 20 years now. My strategy has been to buy and hold. 43, Ben. So it started at 23, right? So this goes to show the benefit of being in the game for a long time. My strategy has been to buy and hold. Some of the properties I've owned have been cosmetically renovated and others have been structurally renovated over the years. My properties are located in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, and a couple in the US. I currently own 12 properties. I work full-time in a banking role and recently have other business interests outside of property. I've run my property investment portfolio as a business over this time, and on a monthly basis, I maintain a spreadsheet where I update my assets, liabilities, and cash flow position. The data is a real-life example of the buy and hold strategy and could be of interest to you and your listeners. Basically, it shows the slow burn of building the first million net that took 17 years. However, then jumps rapidly as the exposure to the market grows and the property market does the heavy lifting. So from $1 million to $2 million, it took 10 months, Ben. From 2 million to 3 million, it took 27 months, Ben. 3 to 4 million took 38 months, and 4 to 5 million took 9 months. So the first net million took 17 years. The last million took 9 months, Ben, out of that example. So I'm not looking to be interviewed or my full name used. However, thought this data might be useful as a real life example of what you consistently talk to. Regards, Dean.
Let's give Dean a round of applause. Yeah. I mean, silently going about it, boringly potentially going about it, still running it as a business though. So Dean, congratulations for you. That's an outstanding result. Imagine what that's going to be like when you're 53.
Oh my
God! It's going to be like when you're 63. Hey, my only value add I can give you, Dean, is maybe jump out of the spreadsheet and jump into more and managing it all in there. And that might make life a little bit easier for you.
Make those insights super straightforward.
Yeah. Other than that, it sort of backs up what we've been talking about, right? And that's the proudest part of the work that we do in our advisory business is that you're seeing these transformations happening slowly, but they are occurring, right? And having started this in 2007, we seeing some of those clients who have been working with us now for sort of all of that time. It's like, whoa, there's some material outcomes, for those particular clients. So I think
it'd be nice to get to the
that's great.
20-year mark, Ben, too, wouldn't it? So then we can look back and see some
Yeah,
of
we
those
will.
clients who've been in the game for 2
Yeah,
decades
definitely.
and talk to some of those results. So, all right, Ben, just a quick thank you to Georgia, thank you to Justin, thank you to Ruva, and also to Dean for those comments from contributing. And as is always the case, let us know. We'll reach out to you. We'll give you a copy of Start and Build worth just under $500, Ben, just for contributing to our show. And just remind folks, you can reach out to us in a number of places, including me on Instagram, Ben. But if you go to thepropertycouch.com.au, there is a spot for you to leave a question. We would absolutely love to hear from you, because Q&A has been a foundational core of this podcast ever since we started, Ben. And as we are in the well and truly today in the shadows of 500 episodes, Ben,
500.
we will continue to have Q&A as a cornerstone of what we do. Hey, my life hack today, Ben, is it's called Apple Name Drop. So I don't know if you know this, but you can get your phone to do a little fist pump with someone else's phone. So when I was at ARIC over the weekend, someone says, "Oh, give us your number." They've got an Apple phone. All I need to do is get the phone to touch at the top with the other phone, and all of a sudden, Bluetooth, it sends my details to that person and their details to me.
Ooh.
So instead of passing business
Yeah,
cards
or share a card or whatever.
share a card, which you can be able to do, it's effectively the Apple iPhone fist pump, Ben, so that you can share. So I did that a couple of times. It only allows you to share either your mobile or your email address, so it doesn't send the full card, but it's definitely a quick way for you to share the info. Now, basically, you both have to be signed into iCloud to be able to do that. But folks, if you have a Apple iPhone, try it out with one of your friends. Just do a fist pump. The tops of the phones need to come together, Ben, like you'd put two magnets together. Then what will happen is if you both sign into iCloud, the rest will be done. You can share and receive, or just share only. Which is pretty
Nice.
cool.
That's a nice
my
little
life
hack.
hack
Well
today.
done. Very good.
Hey, mate, what's making property news?
Yeah, Bryce, so a story last week caught my eye in just regards to the red tape and the frustration we have in this country around getting building approvals through. And in terms of the worst performers, we're talking about New South Wales and Victoria, where it takes a long time to actually get your building approval so you can start to build your property. So in New South Wales, approval waiting times are 144 days. And Victoria's 144 days. New South Wales is 114 days to get your building approval through. It was also quite interesting in terms of, so that's blowing out. So here we are trying to build these so-called 1.2 million additional homes set by the federal government, in terms of basically just lip service to the Australian people. We rank 23rd out of 33 developed countries for the number of dwellings per 1,000 people, according to figures from the OECD in terms of that. So, we've got even the US, Canada, and most of those other countries are in front of us. We've got, here's a sample of some of the countries that are behind us: Ireland, Slovakia Republic, Slovenia, Poland, Iceland, New Zealand, Luxembourg, Colombia, Chile, and Costa Rica. So it just gives you some idea in terms of how we're going in terms of dwellings per 1,000 people. But what also caught my eye in the article was the story about effectively the number of approvals that these guys who are building multi complexes had to do. So a developer, Mark Bainey of Capio Property Group, said proposed apartment projects in New South Wales require planning and development approvals from 30 to 40 state and local agencies to get approved. 30 to 40 different ticks in boxes to actually get your final approval to be able to get it out of the ground. Now, of course, safety should always come first, but surely it can be better than that. Surely we can stop the red tape. If we're talking about a housing crisis, we're talking really about a supply crisis. And, the government saying they're doing all this work in this space. Well, We're just not seeing it on the ground yet in terms of how quick it is for you to be able to get your approval done. So that just gives you some idea of the red tape that's happening in the property market, Bryce.
Thank you, Ben. Very good insights there. But we've covered a fair bit of ground today, mate, on the show. But we've got, just want to give a little exciting bit of anticipation for our community, Ben. We are coming up to 500 episodes,
Yep.
and it's probably only important to us as a milestone, more so than the people, Ben. But the idea that we were approaching 500 when we first started seemed like a work of fiction. But you have got an incredible guest that you've reached out to lined up. So just want to build a bit of anticipation, Ben, that the idea around the 500th was to try and help our community bring some of this all together, right? It's not just tactics and the latest strategy. It's what are some of the things that we can all do to help us succeed and do more. So that's all. That's the little snippet that I'm going to give, Ben. But we're super excited to bring that. So hang in, and we've got some really great guests coming up on both sides of our 500th episode. So a fair bit to cover, mate. But on a big day with a lot covered, mate, throwing it to you, mate. Until next week.
Knowledge is empowering, but only if you act on it.
See you next week, folks.